dairy, and about 8 years later, I went vegan. And I'm just curious about the people in the room here. How many of you were vegetarian by the time you were 18? Wow, okay, that's a large number. How about by the time you were 25? Okay, 30? 40? Okay, so this is interesting. And how many of you find it kind of confounding, frustrating, confusing to understand the mentality of meat or the psychology of meat eating or meat eaters? So this is interesting because most of us were not born and raised vegan and vegetarian. I mean, this is mentality that we can all probably relate to in one way or another. And yet, once we kind of step outside of this consciousness, this mentality, it's so easy to forget. And so, as I'm talking today, I'm going to use the term we. And when I say we, I'm describing everybody who's grown up in a society where meat eating is the dominant mentality. So that includes those of us who are vegan and vegetarian, and the majority of people who are not yet vegan or vegetarian. So, I want to start out and share a little bit about my story. This is me, not to date myself, but this is back in 1972, with my first dog, Fritz. And Fritz, I was told we adopted him when he was about 6 months old, and I was just under 2 years old, so we were both babes. And Fritz lived with us until he died at the age of 13. You know, so Fritz was my first best friend, and he was my first heartbreak. Like so many Americans, I grew up with a dog who I loved like a family member. And I also grew up eating meat, often multiple times a day, and I never thought about how bizarre it was that I could pet Fritz and eat my hamburger without recognizing the profound inconsistencies in my attitudes and behaviors toward animals. You know, I had that knowing without knowing. On one level, I was aware that whenever I sat down to a plate of meat, somebody had to die for my meal. But on another level, I preferred not to know. I just preferred not to connect the dots. So I lived with this internal, largely unconscious moral discomfort when it came to eating animals. There was a gap in my consciousness. And it was really my experience of becoming aware of and working to close that gap that led me to write my book. Now, to give you an example of this gap, I'm going to play a clip from the film trailer for my book.
Imagine your new neighbors have invited you to dinner. Tell us how you make this.
Sure. First of all, you start with 3 pounds golden retriever, well contaminated. Golden retriever? Oh, I forgot. You are Americans with your love affair of dogs. You look like you saw dogs. I'm just kidding. There is nothing but plain old beef. But you're not going to eat it now?
It's a bit hard to get an image out of my mind. Like golden retriever, dog and animal, aren't they? It's disgusting. It's not normal.
This has been doing very well on YouTube, by the way. Obviously, the diner in this clip is an actor. But were this situation to occur in real life, chances are his experience would be exactly the same. Upon hearing that he was supposedly eating golden retriever, he suddenly became disgusted by what he had just moments before found delicious. He suddenly didn't see food on his plate, but a dead animal. And it's interesting, his experience dramatically changed, even though nothing about the meat itself actually changed. What changed was simply his idea of the meat, or his perception of the meat. Now, our perception is the lens that we look at the world through. And when it comes to eating animals, our perception is shaped largely, if not entirely, by our culture. In meat-eating cultures around the world, cultures tend to classify a tiny handful out of thousands of possible animal species, a tiny handful of these as edible. All other species they classify as inedible and therefore disgusting. And so even though the type of animal consumed changes from culture to culture, all cultures tend to see their choices as rational and other cultures' choices as offensive and disgusting. So, what's really striking here is not the presence of disgust. Disgust seems to be the rule rather than the exception. What's striking is the absence of disgust. The question for us is, why are we not disgusted by the 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 or 7 if you're an adventurous leader, species of animals that we've been taught to consume? So I want to talk for a minute about disgust. Disgust is an interesting phenomenon. It's been receiving attention from anthropologists and psychologists alike lately. And while there's a belief that disgust might be a biological reaction that's protective or protects us against ingesting potentially harmful foods, for instance, feces is the universal disgust object. Much of our disgust response is, in fact, learned. Psychologists believe that disgust is ideational. That means we become disgusted at the idea of consuming something, smelling or eating something, rather than what it actually is, which is why the diner was disgusted when he thought he was eating golden retriever, versus when he thought he was eating beef. Disgust is also a moral emotion, that people become disgusted at the idea of eating something that they consider morally offensive. This is why vegans and vegetarians are disgusted in general by all types of flesh, while non-vegans and vegetarians are typically only disgusted by 99.99% of the types of flesh they consume. There's another interesting property about disgust I want to mention, but I want you to do a quick experiment. Imagine that you are a guest at that dinner party, and imagine that you are served a beef stew, and that you say to your host, well, I'm a vegetarian or a vegan, so sorry, I can't eat this. And she says, well, that's okay, just pick out the beef and eat everything around. How many of you would do that, just out of curiosity? Some of you. There's no right or wrong here, this isn't a test. If a fly landed in your soup, how many of you would scoop the fly out and get all the surrounding liquid and, of course, rescue the fly so nobody gets hurt because it's hurt in the soup? A few of you, okay. Now, disgust has what's called contamination properties. There have been a lot of really interesting studies done on this, where they had, participants sit and watch researchers open up fly swatters that were, brand new, take them out of the cellophane and stir a cup of milk. I mean, there's a lot of disgusting things about this, but these were not vegan participants, and they wouldn't drink it. So disgust has what are called contamination properties, in that a disgusting object contaminates anything it comes in contact with. This is why, for instance, the diner in the film clip probably wouldn't have picked out the golden retriever and continued eating the stew. And this is useful to know if you're a vegan or vegetarian, because you can, when somebody says, pick off the ham from the chef salad, you can say, well, would you pick a guinea pig off the chef salad and keep eating it? Most people probably would not. Now, I want to, in order to explain the last principle of disgust, I want to do another quick exercise with you. And I want you to imagine that this diner did not just go through the traumatic experience of being told he was eating golden retriever, but instead was sitting down to a fruit salad, and he was eating that fruit salad thinking, wow, there's this delicious apple in here. And he decides to ask his host, what kind of apple is it? Is it a Fuji? Is it a red delicious? And the host says, it's actually not an apple at all. It's something called salak, which is an Indonesian fruit that resembles an apple, but isn't. Do you think he would have responded the same way he did to eating golden retriever? Why not? It's exotic. It's different. It's very similar to an apple, but it's not an apple, so what's the difference? Any ideas?
Maybe you would think that plants don't feel pain, or they don't have feelings and spirits.
Possibly. Researchers have found that people are disgusted not by plant products, but by animal products. And this is very interesting. And the plant products that do disgust people typically are products that resemble animal products, like mucousy okra, for instance. So when it comes to eating edible animals, it seems that there is a gap in our perceptual process. We don't make the connection between the meat on our plate, the living being it once was. We have to disconnect psychologically and emotionally from the truth of our experience. We have to numb ourselves. Now, to give you an understanding of how we cultivate and maintain this gap, I want to go over some definitions with you. Now, you obviously probably know what a vegan or a vegetarian is, somebody who follows along with the tenets. The tenets are the teachings and practices of vegetarianism or veganism. So, what then do we call somebody who's not vegetarian or vegan? What do we refer to them as? Somebody who hasn't read my book, please. Okay, well typically, if you read in the papers, people will say omnivores versus vegetarians, right? So, if we are in fact naturally omnivorous, which is up for debate, I'm as omnivorous as a vegan as somebody who eats animals. An omnivore is simply an animal, human or non-human, that can ingest both plant and animal matter. And somebody else here said carnivore. Carnivore as well is an animal that needs to ingest flesh to survive. Omnivore and carnivore describe a person's biological or physiological disposition. What's another term we use for people who are not vegetarian or vegan? Meat eater. I've been saying this throughout the presentation, meat eater, but how accurate is this? This describes a behavior as though it's divorced from a belief system. This is why we don't say plant eater when we're referring to vegans and vegetarians, because we recognize that eating plants is an expression of a deeper belief system or a deeper ideology. And when eating animals is not a necessity, it's a choice, and choices always stem from beliefs. So this is why I use the term carnism to describe the ideology or belief system. Ideology is a belief system in which it's considered ethical to eat certain animals. We don't name carnism, it makes eating animals seem like it's a given rather than a choice. And I also say carnist to describe a person who follows the tenets, the teachings of carnism. It only makes sense if we have a name for vegans and vegetarians that we have a name for people who follow a different belief system. We tend to assume it's only vegans and vegetarians who bring our beliefs to the dinner table, but most people don't, for example, love dogs but eat pigs because they don't have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. Now, carnism is not meant to be a pejorative term. It's simply descriptive, like Buddhist, raw Buddhist, socialist, capitalist. If people consider this a negative, it's probably because on some level they consider eating animals a negative. Now, carnism is a special type of ideology. It's a dominant ideology. It's invisible, it's entrenched, it shapes beliefs, behaviors, norms, laws, etc. And it's also a violent ideology in that it is literally organized around physical violence. Meat cannot be procured without slaughter. And dominant, violent ideologies use a set of social and psychological mechanisms to enable humane people to participate in inhumane practices without fully realizing what they're doing. Carnism teaches us how not to feel. What carnism does is it blocks our awareness of what psychologists refer to as cognitive moral dissonance. Cognitive moral dissonance is the internal moral discomfort we feel when our values are not in alignment with our practices. And we all experience this. It's simply a matter of degree. When it comes to eating animals, clearly there's a conflict here. I want to share with you a quote from one of my research participants, a carnist, who I've been talking about very comfortably about the different types of food she eats and prepares and her experience eating and preparing these foods. And when I asked her about eating meat, she got emotional, and here's an excerpt of what she said. I mean, there are so many mortifying things in our culture and society, but killing animals for food certainly is one of the worst. And people ignore it the most because they think that animals don't matter. I feel a lot for these animals. Just the thought is really upsetting. I'm crying. And she started to cry. She was talking to me. So when we experience cognitive moral dissonance, discomfort, and we seek to alleviate it. And in order to do this, we have three choices. We can either change our self-concept, we can change our core value system. What this means is we can say, yeah, I suck, I'm a bad person, I don't care about animals, and so be it, I'm evil. And research shows us that this is not going to happen to 99% of people, and I don't know why they needed to conduct research on this, but we do have empirical evidence to show that everybody needs to believe that they're living a moral life. We all need to feel this way. So if we're not going to change our self-concept, what can we change? What do you think?
Behavior.
Well, one thing you can change is your behavior, and in this case it would mean you can stop eating animals and there's no more conflict. But as you probably know, most people do not do this. And so there's a third option, which is to change our perception of our behavior, and it's around this third option that carnism is organized. This is the mentality of me. Now, I have told you that carnism uses social and psychological defenses to maintain itself. The primary defense of the system is invisibility. And the primary way it stays invisible is by remaining unnamed. If we don't name it, we can't talk about it. We can't talk about it, we can't question it, we can't challenge it. Like I've said, meat eating seems like a given rather than a choice, just the way things are. But carnism also maintains invisibility by keeping the victims of the system out of sight and conveniently out of public consciousness. And there are many different groups of invisible victims. The first group, most of, if not all of you are aware of here, and don't worry, there's no gore in this presentation. I actually saved that for the presentations I give to carnists. They need to see it, you don't. Is the non-human victims. You know, 10 billion non-human victims every year. This is land animals alone, not even including fish and others. I just couldn't resist. I don't know how this happened. And I think it's even a golden retriever. I guess we all have our preferences, right? That little chick looks so jealous. Maybe I'm projecting. And of course, our environment is an invisible victim. In 2007, the UN issued a report stating that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems facing the world today. Carnism is a system of victimization. It victimizes all of us, everyone, everything on the planet. Slaughterhouse workers and meat packers, most of whom are non-English speaking immigrants, legal or illegal, who have to work in a highly dangerous, death-saturated environment day in and day out, and not surprisingly have high rates of addiction and post-traumatic stress, are also victims of the system. And a couple of titles of OSHA, federal OSHA accident reports, I took 2 out of maybe 50 that I had, give you an idea of what they have to deal with for the people sitting in the back. One of them is employee hospitalized for neck laceration from flying blade. Employee's arm amputated when caught in meat tenderizer. And again, I saved the worst of these for the carnists, so you can imagine. And in fact, in 2005, for the first time ever, Human Rights Watch issued a report criticizing a single U.S. industry, the meat industry, for working conditions so appalling they violate basic human rights. And we are the invisible victims of carnism. Whether we're vegan, vegetarian today, most of us grew up eating animals, and most people continue to eat animals. We pay for carnism with our health, as animal products consumption has been connected with the leading diseases in the Western world and leading pandemic flus. We pay for carnism with our taxes, $7.64 billion per year to be exact, in meat subsidies, subsidies that have been criticized across the political spectrum as one of the most egregious corporate welfare programs in the history of the country. And we pay for carnism with our hearts and with our minds. Because in order to eat other animals, we have to disconnect. We have to shut down our empathy and block our awareness. And empathy and awareness are integral to our sense of self. But invisibility can only protect us so much. You know, the system, hints of the truth surround us. For instance, the resilient vein in the drumstick, vegetarian guests at dinner parties, the hog on a spit at a company barbecue, and an endless supply of dead animals everywhere we turn in the form of meat. So when invisibility inevitably falters, the system needs a backup. It needs to teach us to justify eating animals. Now, there's a vast mythology surrounding meat, but all of these myths fall in one way or another under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification, and many of you in this room are probably all too painfully familiar with these. What do you think they are?
Necessary, natural.
You've probably heard it all before many, many times. Eating meat is normal, natural, and necessary. And, perhaps not surprisingly, these same myths have been used to justify violent ideologies throughout the course of human history. For the people in the back, slavery, male dominance, heterosexual supremacy. One myth is so particularly resilient that I just couldn't help mentioning it. The protein myth. And, as we know, this is a myth. I rest my case. But the myths of meat persist despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And this is because the system is so entrenched. When a system is entrenched, it's embraced and maintained by all of the major social institutions, from the family to the state. And I'm going to use a quote from a 19th century French political economist that I think sums this up quite well. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men and women living together in society, they create for themselves, in the course of time, a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. And when we're born into an entrenched system, we inevitably absorb the system's logic as our own. We internalize carnism. We learn to see the world through the lens of carnism. And carnism teaches us to think and feel in certain ways that distance us from our emotions and distort our perceptions of meat and the animals that we eat so we can feel comfortable enough to consume them. For example, it teaches us to see animals as objects. So we refer to this, I used to say chicken, I think it might be turkey, I don't know, it's been that long, as something rather than someone. It's a lot easier to eat something than it is to eat someone. Or we call this little lamb it, a thing, rather than he or she. Carnism teaches us to see animals as abstractions, as lacking in any individuality. We see them as nothing more than abstract members of a generalized group about which we've made stereotypical assumptions. A pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. Like other victims of violent ideologies, we give them numbers rather than names. And a good example of this is another quote from my doctoral research from a meat cutter who said to me, "I don't think of farmed animals as individuals. I wouldn't be able to do my job if I got that personal with them." When you say individuals, you mean as a unique person, as a unique thing with its own name and its own characteristics, its own little games that it plays? Yeah? Yeah, I'd really rather not know that. I'm sure it has it, but I'd rather not know it. Carnism teaches us to place animals in rigid categories in our minds so that we can harbor very different emotions toward different species and afford them a very different level of moral concern. And this is exemplified in a quote from a carnist I interviewed who told me quite openly that she eats all different types of meats. I was going through my checklist. You eat this, this, and this. When I got to veal, she paused and she responded, "Well, let's just say I came to your house and you told me that I had just eaten veal. I'd probably vomit. Like, I have to get that out of my system." And she made some heaving sounds that I couldn't figure out how to include in here. And when we look at the world through the eyes of carnism, we fail to see the absurdities of the system. We see somebody selling themselves, carving themselves up, happily beseeching the viewer to eat them. We fail to see the horror, we fail to see the insanity
of the system. But there is good news, and the good news is that we care. People care. Carnists care. Yes, even carnists care. I've been speaking and teaching about meat production for nearly 2 decades, and I have never once come across a single person who doesn't cringe when faced with images of animals suffering. We care about animals, and we care about the truth, and carnism depends on our not caring, and the system is based on deception. The carnism it's a house of cards. It's a fractured and fragmented system that needs a strong fortress to protect itself from its very own proponents. I mean, why else would people need to go through such mental gymnastics to eat animals, if not because they care? And history shows us again and again that when we make that connection, when we close the gap in our consciousness, that we are willing to stand up and fight against all forms of cruelty and injustice. So, moving beyond carnism, it requires that we bear witness, as all of you have chosen to do. Bearing witness means being willing to see the truth with our eyes as well as with our hearts. And if you think about it, throughout the history of humankind, virtually every atrocity has been made possible because a populace turned away from a reality that they felt was too painful to face. And virtually every revolution, every social transformation was made possible because a group of people chose to bear witness and demanded that others bear witness as well.